thank you for inviting me, and it's great to see how many people come to these events, because it is definitely worth supporting. I think your CAN group is probably one of the most active, so it's good to be here. So tonight I've deliberately called it regenerative land management as opposed to regen agriculture, because it's much wider than just agriculture and farming. So that was deliberate. So we're going to talk about regenerative land management, what it is, why it's important, and what we can all do to try and actually make a difference in that respect. So just a little bit backwards about me. As Belle said, that I live just outside Stroud, and a little herd of red poll cattle that we manage on doing lots of conservation grazing around Ruscombe, Randwick, the Slad Valley, Chalford Valley, and we do quite a lot of conservation grazing with them for the Wildlife Trust and the National Trust. We've got a fantastic team of checkers for the Wildlife Trust, so I don't have to go up to all the different places every day, which is incredibly useful. But we take the cattle through from birth to finishing, and we do a little small box beef scheme, so our food miles are very low, and they are one of the most efficient ways of converting grass to a really high protein, nutrient dense product. So, and in doing that, helping managing our really good species rich grasslands around the Stroud valleys. So that's what they do with that, so the little farm at home. I've spent apart from the last couple of years, the last 20 years working for the National Trust as a land use and farming advisor, and that was working with some National Trust staff, but also a lot of National Trust tenants, and encouraging them and working with them to look at different environmental management schemes on their farms. And over the years, I've seen some really significant changes in farming with those people, and they've gone from fairly intensive agriculture and some using quite a lot of artificial inputs to a much more gentle way of working with nature and working with the environment. And consistently, those farms have turned more profit by doing that. Even though the overall output might be slightly less, their profit is greater. And the one thing that has really struck me, again, every time, is the enthusiasm and how proud those farmers are to show off that nature that's developing back on their farms, and they want people to come and see it, and that's something that it's fantastic to see, because people do want to do it. Farmers don't do it, they don't farm the way they farm because they don't have any, because they are forced to. The systems are inconsistent at the moment and not supporting them. So now I started work early last year for Stroud District Council as their strategic lead for nature recovery and biodiversity. It is a bit of a mouthful. There is only me at the moment, but there are, so it's quite a large role, but it's quite an important one, because it's looking at the land management within Stroud District, but also that Stroud actually have control over. So some of it is control and some of it is influence. So we have a lot of housing stock. We're one of the few councils that do still have their own housing stock. And most of those areas of housing have got some bit of land. It might only be a lawn this big as this room, but it's big enough to make a difference and start influencing the people that are living there. So we're looking at the bits of land management in that scale, but also looking at the wider scale, like Selsley Common and Stratford Park and Stringers Wood, which are the biggest land holdings that the council have. One of the other things I'm working on is developing to try and get a cohesive active farmers group around Stroud to work together. There is a farmers group that works down the River Severn, but the Stroud further on the Vale and Stroud valleys, farmers are quite challenging to bring together. So any assistance on that front, I'm more than happy to accept help. But it is trying to get farmers to actually share knowledge, and for the people that are doing things for nature to let other people know what they're doing and how they do it and how it fits in with their businesses. So that's what I'm doing now. I've got other projects which we'll talk about as we go through. But going back to land management itself and regenerative land management, is it important? Do we actually need to do anything? Are we bothered? I'm presuming that you are bothered, because that's why you're here tonight. But climate change is with us. I mean, the last few weeks in Europe and across this country, the level of rainfall is unprecedented. So we've got to start doing something. We can't assume that business as usual is an option. So we do need to start looking at that. If we do nothing, things are going to get worse. Things will probably get worse anyway, not being too much of a doom monger, but I think business as usual is not an option. The change that we can try and develop and need to develop cover a whole multitude of factors. If we can actually start changing the way land is managed, we are affecting overall our health and well-being. We're affecting the diversity that our children and our grandchildren will grow up in. We can lock up as much carbon as we like, but if we've got no diversity, we're finished anyway, frankly. So, that is really important. Food security is talked about quite a lot at government level. At the moment, that's vulnerable. We import massive amounts of our food, and a huge proportion of the countries that create that food for us are in even more vulnerable situations than we are. So it doesn't take much to have supermarkets, last summer with no tomatoes, which that might seem quite minor, but it's a very easy thing to escalate if we're not considering what we're doing. And the food security itself has a knock-on effect on our social and economic sustainability, because that is what brings groups together. So it's very important. For me, one of the key things is we are what we eat. The quality of our food affects our health. There was I can never remember the name of the doctors, but there were doctors that used to do lots of experiments on themselves. Not Michael Mosley, it was another one. But they were doing some experiments or testing gut biome bacteria, and when they looked at the gut biome of a teenage person in the middle of Africa who was eating very much, raw foods and natural foods, the good bacteria was something like 240 in the gut. They did the same test on the same teenager in America, and the good bacteria was 8. And I mean, it's a massive difference, and that has been shown to have a knock-on effect on all sorts of different conditions, including our weight and everything else. So the food quality we eat is really important. And lastly, for me, the resilience of our landscape. Again, going back to the rain that we've just had, our landscape is becoming less and less resilient. The rivers over the last few days are brown. And that is all, yes, it's obviously soil, but that is all a cost to the farmer, a cost to all of us going downstream. So all those nutrients are being lost, it's polluting, and it's costing then to get the stuff out. So the resilience of our landscapes are decreasing, and we need to try and do something about that. So regenerative agriculture is, I know this is agriculture, not land, but it covers, it is wider land as well. So what it isn't is very prescriptive. What it is it's a holistic way of looking at how we manage our surroundings. So it's not one thing, but it's there to improve what we regenerate. We shouldn't have to regenerate, but we do. So that's where we are. And whether we like it or not, our agricultural systems over the last 50 years have resulted in degradation of nature, of biodiversity, soil health, all of it. And that's not. It's not really, it's not because the farmers wanted to do that. They've been pushed to do that, largely. by the systems that we're operating in. And they've been being paid for production at the expense of biodiversity and nature's health. So this is the regen agriculture movement is a response to that, to the environmental damage that has been caused by conventional agriculture. And it's always slightly disheartening when I go driving around. The valleys around Stroud are quite difficult to really make a mess of because they're all quite steep, so you can't get big machinery on. You go down to the Severn Plain and it's flat and it's accessible. It's very wet, but they can nevertheless get whacking great machinery on. So that's what they do. I mean, that's a good generalisation, and I accept that there are some very good spots, as you get down flatter. But you go down and you can see, if you see bare soil, that's a problem. You don't want to see bare soil because that makes it vulnerable. So, at long last, there is a movement. There is a movement about regenerative agriculture. There's how many of you have heard of the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which is great. So the Oxford Farming Conference, which is run by the NFU, who's been going on for decades, the Oxford Real Farming Conference has gone on for probably about 10 years, I think now, might be a bit more. What I'd like is those two to actually combine and talk to each other, but we haven't got there yet. But it's a really good conference of all sorts of alternative farming systems. And I mean, if people get a chance to go, it's a 2-day event normally, and I think they're actually doing more online. So if you get a chance to listen to some of the talks, it's definitely worthwhile having a look and seeing the various different things that they discuss. But there's a big movement, and there's much more of a movement, I think, in asking, how our food is produced and why, and what that overall effect is. If you look at the food industry as a whole, nobody pays the true cost of food, and that's not necessarily just for the potato. It's for the damage that is done to the soil and to the environment in getting that potato to grow. And at the moment, we're not paying the true cost. And that's something that is difficult to deal with because people don't necessarily have the money to do that. But it's not recognised that the cost is greater than what supermarkets are actually providing. So what is regenerative agriculture? What does it do to our environment and regenerative land management? Soil health, if soil health is poor, we're not going anywhere. I've seen some farming on top of the Cotswolds, again, because there were big open fields. They're quite dry because they're high up. So it meant that you could get very big machinery on. So you could, even though a lot of stone, nevertheless you could plough through it. I've been on some farms where after a heavy rainstorm, it was dry within minutes because it was like hydroponic farming. And the only way those crops could grow on that is if you're putting lots of inputs on it. So that soil is not healthy. It's not being able to hold moisture. It's got very little organic material within it. And yet they're getting a crop off it because of the artificial inputs that they put in. But that's not a healthy environment. What's growing on there must have some sort of chemical residue in it. I know you get told it doesn't. But it's very difficult to see how it can't because of what's put on it. So the soil health, looking at how that's managed, is really important at how we start. And this applies to our gardens too, and our vegetable gardens. So within agriculture, terms such as cover cropping, reduced tillage, composting generally, all will help with managing that soil structure and soil fertility. So the cover cropping, when I said earlier on, I don't like to see bare soils. Maize is a really challenging crop to grow in that most farmers put maize on and they don't put anything underneath, and because it's quite a dense crop, you get a very blank soil. So as soon as they harvest it, you've just got bare soil everywhere. More people now are planting clover or grass underneath, so when they cut it, there's actually a cover to protect the rest of the soil. And that is it's a really important change of management. Not all farmers are doing that still, but it's a very easy one for them to do, and that protects their soil and it saves them money in the end because they're saving themselves from losing those nutrients downstream. So it's looking at how all that land is actually protected. The mycorrhizal activity within soils can be damaged with an application of fertilizer, an application of herbicide, an application of pesticide, or a jolly good plough. So mycorrhizal, so fungi activity within soils. Fungi love dark, damp places, and habitually, whether it's farming or vegetable growing, what do? We normally dig it and turn it over. So we expose it to light and dry. So all that fungal activity has to restart again before it can work with the crop that's being grown. So if you can minimize or reduce or stop exposing all that to the sunlight, you'll actually get a much healthier soil that will hold together, but a much healthier soil that will work together with the crop that you're growing, actually in a symbiotic relationship, helping them get the sugars and nutrients to those plants. So yeah, how we do that, how we manage that soil right from the beginning is pretty critical. The crop rotations, if you put one crop in all the time, you will get pests and diseases that think, yippee, there's my food again, so off they go. So actually, the crop rotations are really important because you then reduce the need for any herbicide and fertilizers, herbicides and pesticides, because you change that food source, so you change the creatures that are likely to actually want to be there. The cover crops and legumes, cover crops I've just mentioned, and legumes, I'm sure most people are completely aware of this, but if you can plant a legume, whether it's a clover or a bean crop, you'll help replenish that nitrogen. So as part of a normal rotation, to actually have a crop like that, it can be in quite intensive agricultural systems, but you're starting to replenish the nutrient levels that you need for growing without using an artificial input. What I mentioned earlier on is that the regenerative land management is a holistic look at how you manage that land. So the water management techniques, admittedly this last weekend was a bit of an extreme and quite difficult to deal with anywhere, but the farming, it's based on things like natural flood management solutions to put in place so you actually can hold the water in places better. Contour farming, so when land is cultivated, it's not done up and down the hills where it just creates natural channels for everything, again, to be washed around. So it's looking at that contour farming. And it's all aiming at improving the water retention in the soil. And that helps the health of the soil, but it also helps those downstream, from getting that more and more water that you don't want. Carbon sequestration will happen. If land is managed properly, it will happen. If you are exposing, going back to turning lots of ploughing, if you're exposing soil, you're losing carbon. So if you're keeping soil covered, you're going to be sequestering carbon. And all of this affects the economic viability of something. As I said, all the people that I know that have gone towards more farming with nature, their profits have gone up. So when we talk about sustainable agriculture or sustainable land management, that sustainability has got to include financial viability. Because if a land, whether it's a farmer or a land manager of some other sort, cannot afford to do stuff, then it's not going to happen. So they to be able to reduce the input costs is actually quite a significant change. Because the costs of fertilizers and herbicides right at the moment is absolutely huge. So that the input costs are critical. There are a couple of reasons. One is habit. The biggest reason, I think, is that farmers over the last however many years have invested hundreds of thousands in machinery that we're then coming along saying, You don't really need that because you don't need a huge tractor because you're not going to be doing such deep ploughing. And you know, for years they've been sitting. This is a bit sort of typical, you know, not necessarily genuine, but you know, they sit in the pub on a Friday night and sort of talk about what new tractor they bought, and the tractors are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And those tractors are the ones that are causing more and more compaction, but enable them to plough or access land. And yeah, suddenly we're saying, but you don't necessarily need all that. And so that how they change from that significant investment to doing different management is a challenge. And how they do that is difficult. The other thing is that you generally find with more regenerative agriculture is that you see it's a slightly, I don't want to use the word messy, it's a more diverse environment. And you do get people standing over the gate saying, they don't know what they're doing, isn't that a mess? I can see thistles there. I had somebody do this at a meeting with me actually recently. And they don't, the pressure to farm or to have your garden looking, you know, like a cricket pitch is quite significant as peer pressure from your neighbouring people looking over. And I don't have an easy solution for that, to get away from that, but it's one that we've got to start celebrating the diversity, not talking about it as a mess. You're right. It's not an overnight switch over. I would normally expect farmers to, I mean, within 5 years you definitely should be, but within 2 or 3 you should be starting to see that change, and the soil health starts to get back. So you don't, because if a soil has been used to having lots of inputs and then you just suddenly stop, it's going to be fairly nutrient poor for a while. So it does take a bit of time to get back to that.
Do you think it would help actually to have certification, a bit like organic certification? You know, do you think maybe that would be the spur?
For regenerative farming? I think it would in a way, but it's very difficult to be as precise as the organic. That's the problem. I think it'll probably get there at some point, but I think we're a little way off it at the moment. I think you're right, and I think the farming community is still. I mean, I know somebody who is probably very close to my age. His father still doesn't let him sign the checks or make the decisions, and it happens a lot. And so the next generation are not being given the freedom to actually make those changes either, which is hard. I think it is in some. I don't think it's that consistent at the moment. I think there are some agricultural courses that are still churning out the bits that were the systems that were taught 20 years ago. I think it's a slow process of change. Fabulous to hear. That is good to hear. I mean, I hope most of them are doing it, but as you say, that cohort of students have still got to have the wherewithal and the ability to make the decisions on the farm. And at the moment, the cost of those inputs now is so high. That's also what's making people look back. And it's looking at what our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, you know, they managed perfectly well without. They probably weren't producing the same volume, but no, you're absolutely right. And there was a lot of pressure to produce the quantity. But I think the more diversity you can have on an area of land, the healthier it is. So actually the healthier crops you get, and the more resilient it is. So you're right, it's a full circle, isn't it? If you see field margins, and a lot of the agri-environment schemes that are still in place, we're looking at significant, varying from 6 to 20 or 30 metre margins sometimes, and they could be for nectar-rich or pollen-rich, or various different options. And you're right; those margins are beautiful. The farmers that I worked with that, and I had a few examples where there were neighbouring farms, and I said, well, if you can get that margin here, and your neighbour is there, and they can do it the other side of the hedge, you've suddenly got a massive area that, instead of little stepping stone areas. So, you're right. It doesn't. We still need food, and we still need. There is a need for grain and other cereal crops. So it's just how we do that alongside nature instead of trying to fight it and trying to stop nature entirely. Most farms, if you actually get them into, they will have some unproductive areas. So if you can take those out of use, they're actually saving themselves money generally. So, but yeah, thank you for that. Why is it important in Stroud? I think around the Stroud valleys, we've got a lot that's going on very small scale. And there are a lot of people that own little bits of land. Those are starting to link up. But in Stroud District, it would be great if everything looked, rosy and all the farms work together to create this. But, we can start setting an example, even if what we're looking at is small units at the moment. So, again, going back to it's important for Stroud, it's important for everywhere, because it is important for our long-term health and well-being, and the biodiversity. If Stroud District don't do things, then how can we ask our residents to do things? And that's what we need everybody to feel that they can do something. So it is actually, how do we do that? How do we create that better environment? The environmental benefits of doing this on a district level only are there to then expand. So it's important, however big or small, that we do that. And Stroud is an interesting environment because we have got from the valleys down to the River Severn, and the valleys do funnel that water very fast when it goes down. So the resilience of the landscape higher up of the points of those valleys is pretty critical. So we need to look at how that land is managed. And it doesn't take very much. As I said, a lot of the rivers are pretty brown at the moment. And that is because all the tops of the hills are slightly more vulnerable. So it's worth looking wider than just those little valley spots. But I think you just got to keep in mind that regenerative farming overall, it supports the environment, but it also strengthens that social and economic fabric of local communities, because that's what it helps support. Hopefully it helps involve people at that level as well. So within Stroud itself, some of the things that I've been working on, as I said, it's small, but it's building. So this is at Heath Court in Dursley, and there are two blocks of flats there that the council own, and there's about half an acre of, possibly not even that much of, and it's been mown habitually for I don't know how many years. And so it's just grass. It's an acrylic green colour all the way over. So what we have looked at is just, let's change this management. So we're going to let some grass grow, so not cut, but we are going to mow paths through it, because what we want is for local residents to actually feel that they're welcomed into the space. So they're still going to walk into, they're going to have areas that are welcoming in, and we're going to plant wildflowers, wildflower seed and bulbs. So that's going to happen. The bulbs are supposed to be happening this winter, so that for the spring there'll be something there, and then the wildflower seed will be probably early next year. The school is the local primary school, and they're going to come in and help do the planting, but also then use it as an education space themselves and help monitor it and help measure what's coming up. So it's a very, very direct getting involved and getting all age groups involved. The benefit of doing this, as I said, this is only a little bit in Dursley. We've identified probably 25 or 26 different sites that the council own with around housing stock that have got these bits of land that are just habitually mown. So we're not at the moment really setting any example whatsoever to our residents. So this one is the first one. So it's all nicely costed. We're going to have our little plaque saying, which you can just about see the children holding it, saying Nature Recovery Area. And it's going to be costed, so it'll be an easy rollout to the rest of the sites around Stroud District. So as I said, it's small, but it is starting, I'm hoping, to influence people. Parish councils, I've done a couple of training sessions for parish council clerks and invited them to bring themselves plus any councillors that want to come. And we've done a couple online and we've done one out on site. To talk about the local nature action plans. So from January this year, there was additional duty on local authority organisations, right down to parish council level, to I can't remember the words, it was slightly woolly, along the lines of sort of take account of, you know, the nature. So it didn't actually tell you to do very much. But what we've been encouraging them to do is to ideally to form biodiversity groups, which I think you have got up and running very successfully anyway, but then to look at what you've got on site in your parish. So it's a habitat mapping exercise, and to start identifying where the gaps in those habitats are. So do you have hedgerows with gaps in? Do you have grasslands that are nice bits of grassland, but then, you know, a space between that is mown all the time, for example? So it's looking, we've done a few training courses, and the parish councils are starting to actually develop that. And I've got a number now that are in the process of actually putting their local nature action plans together. And Belle, you said that you've got your on that way and develop it. You've got a meeting coming up in February, didn't you? So
of local groups getting together to discuss that,
yeah.
Well, to look at biodiversity projects
Yeah.
and share experience,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. And for me, that's really useful, the fact to even get a networking group, because one of the things that I've encouraged them to do is to talk to their neighbouring parishes. Because, you know, nature doesn't stop at the parish boundary, so it's looking at those habitats and where can those be linked to the neighbouring parishes. Can the hedges be grown up? You know, could you plant a couple more trees to actually get that habitat connectivity going through the different areas? And then the local schools project is something that, again, it's a slow but developing. I've got about 4 or 5 schools now that I'm working with, looking at what can be done on their school grounds and getting it mapped. Because a lot of these projects are very dependent on one person normally. There'll be one teacher that's really enthusiastic and then they leave and it all goes to pot. So what we're trying to do is get school grounds mapped to identify what they can do to help nature and what they can add to it, but actually getting it mapped with each area with a little bit of a management plan for each area, so that hopefully there is some sort of continuum, even not dependent on one person. So that's something that I'm amazed, I've been amazed how big school grounds are. And most of them, again, are mown. So that's that we're looking at the schools project locally. The same applies to, I've had a couple of meetings with the local church groups as well, to look at the churchyards for exactly the same reason, because a lot of them, and there's a lot of pressure in churchyards particularly, because people want to be able to access the graves of their loved ones that are there. And we having had a couple of sessions on site again with in the churchyard, people suddenly realise that they can get to graves remarkably easily, even if the grass is a little bit longer. So it's part of it is education and expectation, and you know what can people deal with and what are they prepared to have. Apparently it's relatively recent that churchyards have been mown. It used to be 50 years ago it wasn't. So looking at the wider landscape, that's obviously fairly critical. What we've talked about, I mean, the farming aspect is definitely the wider landscape. The small sites are important because they do still create those stepping stones. So if you within Stroud District, we're incredibly lucky because we've got fantastic grasslands, woodlands and wetlands. And I mean the grasslands, we've got Stinchcombe Common, Selsley Common, Rodborough and Minchinhampton, Juniper Hill, Painswick Beacon, there may be others, there's Edge Common. They're all triple SI for grasslands. We've got a huge area actually within this parish, within this district. So it's just how we link those up and how those are managed. But as part of this, the local nature recovery strategy for Gloucestershire is being developed. That's led predominantly by Gloucester County Council and the Local Nature Partnership. And it's something that all counties have been commissioned to do as part of the Environment Act again. And so by the time the Gloucestershire one should be being published spring next year, but all counties, they're all in the process of pulling these together. And when they're using, Gloucestershire is certainly using the Nature Recovery Network mapping, which the Wildlife Trusts coordinate. But by the time they're done across the country, theoretically, we will have this seamless map going across the whole country showing the priority habitat areas. And that is really important, it's critical, because what that will affect is that the priority habitat areas can be looked at to see, again, where the gaps are and where do we need to do more work and what the potential is to enhance those priority areas. It also will have an effect on have all of you heard of biodiversity net gain? For better or for worse. But the biodiversity net gain will be linked to those priority habitat areas within the local nature recovery strategy. And if somebody is trying to build and want development within those priority habitat areas, their mitigation is going to have to be more. So there's a 1.5 times multiplier for what they have to do and what they have to pay for. So the local nature recovery strategies across the whole country are going to be really important documents. The other thing, again, just with the landscape, is unless we start making changes, we're not in the position to try and start influencing others. So it's how we do that and how we can join everything up. No, not necessarily. I think it will be. At the moment, because of the stage that we're at, it's not. So there are a couple of sites within the district that we're looking at. Basically, there'll be habitat banks. So if the smaller developers, the bigger, really big housing developments will almost certainly be able to cope with the BNG on site. Well, that's part of our expectation. So they might well just build a few less houses, but the cost of them taking to pay for it off-site is going to be significant. So most of the really big developments, I think, will try and deal with it on-site. So the slightly more, so we can't then, as a planning authority, we can't control. If it's on site, it's on site, and because they have to try and do it as close to the site as possible. So the ones that we probably have more control over are the smaller developers, or the ones that need half a unit or 2 units, biodiversity net gain units. And so we're developing sites that will potentially be habitat banks. So they will be ones that you can add a little bit each time. And they will be more directed, and I hope those will be part of the priority areas. But it's looking at what you can get the most gain for as well. But it becomes, the further away you get, it becomes more and more expensive for the developer. So they want to do it as close as possible. And if there's nowhere in the county, and they can go neighbouring districts and neighbouring counties, but that all adds to the cost. I think there's quite a lot of greenwashing going on that, particularly with some of the green infrastructure work. And I think if as easy as possible, isn't it? Yeah. But it shouldn't be, if a site is close to a major development and they're saying it's going to reach species-rich habitat, species-rich grassland, the planning authorities should be saying you're not going to do that because it's not realistic, because you're going to have so much people traffic on it. So that conversation has been had. So there should be challenges if people do try and do that. A quick summary of biodiversity net gain. Is that it came into legislation, came into force in February this year for large sites and May for small sites. So a developer has to leave the landscape and the environment a minimum of 10% better condition than when they started. So they have to have done an environmental survey, an ecological survey before they start. If they try and trash it beforehand, it'll be taken back from photographic evidence, Google Earth or whatever, back to 2020. So and they will be penalised if they try and do that. So the mitigation measures is that the first point is you don't damage the environment. The second one, the mitigation is on site or as close to the site as possible, and so that if it's designed so that set out so that it should be like for like. So if you're building on grassland, you've got to find better grassland to replace. So grassland is the most affected, because most developers are not going to build on wetlands or woodlands. So grassland is the one that's in most need. It's a 30-year agreement. So the developer, if it's off-site, a landowner can say, I've had my site assessed and it's this level of grassland now, and I can get it to that level in 10 years, and then I'll manage it for the next however long. And the landowner will be paid for that, for the potentially quite significant chunks of money, and then that becomes the landowner's responsibility. If it's on site and it's the developers, there will be conservation covenants and various different legal agreements. If they go out of business, I don't know. I think it's.
I mean, there are quite strong legislative.
Yeah,
this has got quite a strong legislative envelope around it, but it's all open for how it's going to develop over the next 30 years. Isn't it?
It is. And I mean, the number of planning applications at the moment that Stroud have had successful B&G applications with successful B&G bits with it, I think is possibly one since February. So they either have managed to find ways of evading it, or they haven't filled out all the paperwork. Or there's a metric where that does the calculations for you, or they haven't filled out that properly. So it's a very slow process at the moment, and it's the monitoring of it. That 30-year monitoring is something that the government haven't really thought through. Admittedly, it was the previous government that sort of set it in place, and they promised all sorts of templates and guidance that we've just developed ourselves as we've gone along. So yeah, it is a bit of watch this space. But having said that, it's still a world-leading change in development requirements, and there are lots of other countries that are looking to see how it's implemented. So yeah. Because they're just trying to mitigate the damage that's there on site. Sometimes, that's the mitigation hierarchy. I agree, there are some occasions when, you're right, there would be much better spent, particularly if we've got an area that we know that we can actually influence and improve significantly, then that would be, but that's just the way the legislation is written up at the moment. So there will be more people to do it, but there is an issue with, not just with Stroud, to be honest, there is an issue with enforcement and how this is going to be monitored as it goes forward, definitely. So, who needs to act? Well, all of us. There's no, I mean, as I said, farmers will almost certainly have spaces that, they could actually leave to nature and save themselves money. Consumers, I think, are really, we as a group are critical to how the big industries respond. So I would say always ask. Go know how your food is produced or where it's coming from, and ask. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean to say that you have to buy from there. You can buy from wherever you like, but buy from a point of knowledge, not a point of ignorance. So ask how it's produced and from where. Householders, just don't be too tidy. Leave some messy spaces in the garden, and don't mow your whole lawn. Leave some spaces that are unmown and long. Because that's a fantastic haven for wildlife through the winter. When you do mow, a little bit that we're doing with Stroud, the management of verges is mixed between parish, district and county. It's an absolute, it's a real mixture, and it's very difficult to actually determine exactly who's doing what. But within Stroud, the ones that we do manage, at the moment, again, they've been just mown and mown and mown, and they're mown and everything is just dropped on the floor. Next year, we're actually changing our kit, and we're having things that pick up the clippings, because the picking up of the mowing clippings, even if it's on your own patch at home, is really important, because if you leave it there, it just adds to the nutrients and reduces the overall diversity of the grassland. So any grass that is mown, ideally you take those clippings away. Particularly if it's long, because that'll just form a lovely mulch. So to cut and remove, not cut and leave. And then organisations and local authorities. Again, I think it's up to the local authorities, and that can be down to parish council, but what can we actually affect change, and where can we influence? So let's just have a look at really critical at what we can manage and what we do. So we can all do our bit. That's what we want the verges to look like. As I said, ask where our food comes from. Buy local if you can, because it's just good supporting the farming community. Reduce our obsession with grass cutting. We are obsessed with it. Thank you very much.
I think we've got a bit of time just for a few more questions. So, if we just have sort of half a dozen. Yeah.
There's been quite a lot of scientific evidence to show that if you've got trees within a field, the mycorrhizal activity from the tree roots help they pass all the sugars and nutrients to and fro. So it actually helps the overall health of the soil and that crop. So there's much more agroforestry going on, and the trees that can be classed as agroforestry, they can vary enormously from fruit trees to nut trees to just ordinary any sort of forestry tree as well. So that combination of activity on one area of land is definitely beneficial, and yes, it's definitely happening. I think you're right. I think there are the forestry practices are just as variable as other land use practices. But I think it's probably not as it's not as focused on as the wider agricultural sector. So I think there's an element that people are allowed, they get away with it, or by the time they've felled it, it's too late to do anything about it. But there are some, and again, you see some. Some clear felling may be the right thing to do, but it's got to be from. They would be expected to replant generally, and it's trying to make things the resilience of sort of climate change, and because I always say we should be replanting native trees and native species, and I still largely support that, but then people, we get told that actually with climate change and the warming up of the climate, beech trees particularly are going to be really vulnerable. That's going to really affect the woodlands around here. But my son was on his university placement in Italy last year, and the topography where he was a bit like an enlarged Stroud, and it had all the same woodland mixture, but obviously species that thrived there. So we could have something that looks very similar, but it might not be quite as good initially for our insects. it's a bit of a mixture, but I think the forestry thing is an ongoing discussion. And again, it depends on how much money is in the industry again, doesn't it, about how they can do it or what they do. I mean, we're pushing to have no herbicides for a start. There are some that are very reluctant to sort of give that completely, but I mean, I do talk about it a lot, and I've just written a very basic, quite a basic document about what good habitats look like, which is going to go out to the parish councils around. And I'm actually adding a little bit about soil health and what it should look like and how it should be managed. I think it's really hard because I think baselining for soil is so variable. It is important, and I mean, if farmers don't know what their soil looks like, they should be jolly well going out there digging in and having a look, because they should know what it looks like and what it feels like and what it smells like. But likewise, if you're in your own garden, it probably is be an interesting time to do it now because everything is so sodden. It probably doesn't smell particularly nice. But if you know, on a nice spring day, the soil should smell lovely, and and if it doesn't, there's a problem. And we should all be looking at that. And I mean, the work that I'm going to do with schools, I'd quite like them to start looking and feeling the soils and smelling it and saying what they think. So, but yeah, you're right. The baselining is not.
Yeah. I think one of the problems with baselining insects is having enough people who know what they're looking at.
There's a program that BugLife run. I can't actually. Where you put you monitor on your number plate. So you put in where you're driving. You've got to wash your number plate before each journey, and then it counts. You photograph it and they send that in. So it's a count rather than species. But at least I know it is a count of splats, but it gives an indication of the numbers, because I mean the insect density across the whole of Europe has just dropped. I mean horrific amounts, and yeah, it's a really critical levels actually. There are a couple of things you mentioned there that are, I think, really key. The community involvement, community engagement is really important. And because if we go back and just tell people what we're going to do for their community, they won't. Is that me again? So that how you bring something like that back to the community actually is really important. And the other thing I was going to do is put something out. I was going to ask our PR people if they could put something out on social media platforms just to say, are there any volunteers out there that can come and help their local parish councils? Because that is a sticking point for a lot, that they just don't have the expertise to do it.
I would say I think one of the limitations is having people to organise volunteer groups though. It does need somebody with the time and the effort to actually pull groups together, and and that is quite tricky.
But even within ULI, our WhatsApp group's got 30 people in it now. It needs a couple of organisers to help that, but there are,
it's getting there.
The beginnings that, it's really, again, it's messy. There's no top-down approach to organising it, but it is self-organising.
Yeah.
But that's why those connectivities are quite important between the groups doing that. We had a very enlightened parish councillor, green councillor, who's not a councillor. He pushed forward the plan using the templates and stuff. That then got signed off in January this year, whenever it came in. And at the same time, he set up a WhatsApp group to start doing something, and then that created momentum. So, and in Dursley, it's a bit more. But again, Green Spaces Committee in Dursley suddenly sprang up. There's a few of us who do green stuff around Dursley that could get involved in it, and suddenly it's got a bit of momentum behind it. So it just springs up, but it needs, it doesn't spring up in a structured way. It's an unstructured way.
Well, I think it would be great to get some networking going, because I think that would be really useful.
Yeah. The little bit I've written about sort of what good habitats look like, it's not designed to tell people how to identify, one flower from another. It's actually talking about, what a diverse grassland looks like, and talking about the structure and the colour and the sound that you hear in a healthy environment. And so I've done it for grasses, hedgerows, woodlands. I can't remember. There are sort of half a dozen different habitats, and in a way that's the waterways and streams. What does water look like that's healthy? And a dead straight line that's not what you want.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca,
Thank
for
you
coming
too.
this evening. It's been great actually to sort of get it all put in a slightly wider context than Wootton itself and sort of look at the whole Stroud area. So, thanks very much.
Thank you.